I never imagined that my story would travel so far, beyond the broken streets of Syria, beyond the shattered hopes of my family, beyond the waves of a dangerous sea. But this is my true story, a child's story wrapped in fear, hope, and loss. I am just a boy caught in the midst of a war that no child should ever know. Yet my journey became a psychology-breaking story that touched hearts around the world. Through my eyes, you will see the invisible scars of a child's psyche trapped in chaos, the fragile dreams that flicker even in the darkest times. This story is not just about me, it is a story of millions, the story of Syria, and the story of every child forced to flee their home. As you listen to my tale, prepare to witness the raw depths of human emotion, the true cost of conflict, and the silent cries of a child whose story must never be forgotten. It is hard for me to recall the way things were before everything began to fall apart. The memories feel distant now, as though they belong to someone else, a different life. Syria, the country I called home, was once a place filled with laughter, the sound of children playing, the warm air of summers spent under the clear skies. But it is hard to hold on to those memories, for they were replaced with a world filled with smoke, blood, and the deafening sound of war. The places I used to run through barefoot, the streets where I laughed with my friends, were now filled with rubble and the constant smell of fear. I didn't know it then, but the life I knew was slipping through my fingers, bit by bit. My name is Island Kurdi, and my story, our story, is not just one of survival. It is the story of a child caught in a storm of chaos and loss. This is a true story. The story of a family desperate to escape the grip of violence, to survive in a world that no longer made sense. The story of a child who only wanted to be safe, but who had no choice but to fight for his life, even though he was still too young to understand the full cost of it all. My family and I lived in Kobani, a city in northern Syria that had been ravaged by war. It was a place where the sound of planes and bombs was as familiar to us as the calls to prayer from the mosque. We knew fear, we knew pain, but still, there was hope. There had to be hope, right? My mother, Rehan, would often tell me stories of a place called Canada, a land far, far away, where children could run free in the fields, where there were no bombs, no tanks, no sound of gunfire. It was a dream, a place where we could begin again. My father, Abdullah, would smile and say, "One day, we will be there. One day, you will run free like those children." But I didn't understand. I didn't understand why we had to leave, why the home I loved, the streets where I played, had become dangerous. I didn't understand why my parents were so worried. The world was changing, and I could see the sadness in their eyes. It was only when we left, when the borders became a place of escape, that I realized how much I had lost. It was a bright day when we first began our journey. I remember it clearly, even though it feels like a dream. We packed our things into small bags, enough to keep us alive, enough to survive, but not enough to keep us whole. The house we had lived in for years was no longer ours. The garden where I used to play was empty. No laughter, no toys. We left everything behind in search of safety, in search of a new life. My mother, always so strong, held my hand tightly. Her fingers were warm, but I could feel the tremor in her grip. I tried to comfort her, telling her that everything would be okay. But in my heart, I knew she was scared. We all were. My father was the strongest man I knew, but even he couldn't shield us from what was happening. His voice, usually so calm and confident, now seemed uncertain. He didn't want to say it, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know what was going to happen next. We began our journey on foot through the war-torn streets. There were other families around us, each one carrying their own story, their own fear. Some were crying, some were silent, and others walked like zombies, their faces empty of emotion. But we kept going, walking through the rubble, stepping over broken glass, and ignoring the sounds of violence that seemed to follow us. We couldn't stop. We couldn't turn back. We reached Turkey after days of walking. I remember the exhaustion on my mother's face and the way my father's shoulders sagged. We were tired, we were hungry, but we had to keep going. I could see the fear in my father's eyes, the same fear I felt in my chest. But we didn't have a choice. There was no future for us in Syria. We were refugees, displaced and lost, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a dream of a better life. As a child, I didn't fully grasp the depth of what was happening, but I understood the fear. I understood the pain. I could feel the weight of it on my parents. They tried so hard to protect me, to shelter me from the reality of the world, but even I could see it, the sadness, the exhaustion, the fear. It wasn't just the adults who were scared. I was scared too. I was a child, just a child, and the world was no longer a safe place for me. I remember clinging to my mother's side as we waited for the boat that would take us across the sea. The boat, they told me, would be our escape. The sea was vast, and we had heard stories of people who had made it to safety, who had crossed the water to find peace. My father reassured me, telling me that everything would be fine, but the truth was, we were afraid. The journey ahead was uncertain. The boat seemed too small for the vast ocean we had to cross, but it was our only option. As I sat in my father's arms, staring at the water, I didn't understand what was to come. I just wanted to be safe. I wanted to play again, to laugh again. I wanted the world to be as it was before, bright, full of life, full of hope. But it was no longer that way. My parents did their best to protect me, but deep down, I could feel the weight of their worry. They had made the decision, and now I would follow them. But I didn't know then that my story would become a breaking story, a story that would echo around the world and touch hearts far beyond Syria. The true story of a child whose hope would be tested, whose innocence would be lost, and whose fate would be decided in the cruelest of ways. The boat was small, too small for so many people. There were other families with us, all of them hoping, all of them dreaming of a better future. We sailed across the water, the waves crashing against the sides of the boat. But we held on tight. The sea was our path to freedom. My parents whispered to me that soon we would be in a place where we could be safe, where we could live without fear. But I didn't know that the journey we had just begun would soon become a nightmare. I didn't know that the fragile boat we were in wouldn't survive the storm, that the hopes and dreams we carried with us would be drowned in the cold waters of the Mediterranean. I didn't know that the moment we left the shore would be the moment our lives would change forever. The waves were growing stronger, the boat was rocking, and I could feel the fear rising in my chest. I wanted to cry, but I held back, hoping that everything would be okay. But as the waves hit harder, I felt the boat start to sink. It wasn't just water that was flooding in, it was fear. It was panic. It was the end of our journey. And in that moment, I realized that hope was a fragile thing. No matter how tightly you hold on, no matter how much you believe in the dream of safety, there are forces in this world that you can't control. As the boat tipped, as the cold water pulled me under, I clung to my mother, to my father, but everything went black. My body was cold, my lungs filled with water. The world around me faded away, and I became one with the sea. I didn't know it then, but my story, my life, was no longer mine alone. It was now part of a greater story, a story that would shake the world, a story that would speak for all the children like me. Children lost, children who never had the chance to see the world the way it was meant to be. Looking back, it's hard to understand it all. The journey was supposed to be an escape, a chance at a better life, but instead it became a story of loss, a story that would break hearts and change lives forever. My story is just one of many, but it is a story that speaks for all children like me. Children who were caught in the storm of war, who never had a choice but to run, who escaped to survive. This is my story, a story of a child, of a family, and of a world that failed to protect us. But it is not just my story. It is the story of every child who had to leave behind their home, their safety, their childhood. It is the story of every parent who made the hardest decision of their life, whether to stay and fight or to run and hope. It is the story of a journey that began with hope but ended with heartbreak. In the end, I am just a child. But my story, our story, is more than just a story. It is a reminder of what happens when we fail to protect the innocent, when we fail to protect the most vulnerable among us. It is a breaking story, a story that echoes through time, a story that must never be forgotten. The boat rocked gently at first as we sat huddled together, our faces tense with a mixture of fear and hope. I could feel the salt of the sea air on my skin, a constant reminder that the journey we were on was both a dream and a nightmare. We were leaving behind Syria, the place where I was born, a land torn apart by war. My father held my hand tightly, as if his grip could shield me from the danger we faced. My mother whispered soft words of reassurance in my ear, trying to calm me, but I could hear the quiver in her voice, the fear she couldn't hide. We had crossed miles of land, walked through streets filled with the echoes of gunfire, and now we were at the edge of the world, at the shore where the sea promised safety. The boat before us, small and fragile, seemed too tiny to carry the weight of our hopes. Yet, like many others, we boarded, driven by the desperation to escape the violence that had consumed our home. It was a journey that millions like us had made, one of survival, one that was supposed to lead to freedom. This was supposed to be our way out. The boat was the last glimmer of hope we had. The sea was our escape. My mother, holding me close, said, "Soon we'll be in a place where you can play without fear. There will be no bombs, no soldiers, just peace." But how could I understand? I was just a child, too young to comprehend the true weight of what we were doing. All I knew was that the boat was our chance. I was scared, but I trusted my parents. They had always protected me, and I believed they would keep me safe now. But the sea didn't care about our hopes or our dreams. It didn't care that we were a family, fleeing war, seeking a better life. It didn't care about our story. The water was unforgiving, and our fragile boat, filled with people who had risked everything, was no match for the power of the ocean. The first wave hit hard. I remember the way the boat tilted, the panic in the eyes of the other passengers. The sea had turned on us, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The boat rocked violently, tossing us back and forth like toys in a child's hands. I could hear my father shouting, trying to calm everyone, telling them to hold on, but the noise of the waves drowned him out. The cries of the other families were lost in the roar of the water. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Then, without warning, the boat flipped. The world around me became a whirlpool of water, cold and dark, pulling me down. I could feel my body being yanked beneath the surface, the water rushing into my mouth, my lungs, my eyes. I tried to scream, but the waves swallowed my voice. I reached out in the darkness, desperate to find someone, anyone. But everything was spinning and my arms felt heavy, useless. My mother was nowhere to be seen. My father... In those moments, I felt a fear so deep, so consuming, that it felt like the water itself was inside me, pressing on my chest, suffocating me. The warmth of my family, the safety of their embrace, was gone. I couldn't see them, couldn't feel them. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating, the roar of the ocean, and the darkness closing in around me. When I opened my eyes again, everything was still. The coldness had seeped into my bones, and the world around me had grown eerily quiet. My body floated in the water, lifeless, my eyes staring into the sky above. I could no longer feel the pain, no longer feel the fear. It was as if time had stopped and all that was left was the quiet, endless blue of the sea. But somewhere far away, my father was still searching for us, still calling out my name, still trying to hold on to the hope that we could be found. My father, who had always been my protector, was now alone, adrift in the vast sea of loss and grief. He had given everything to keep us safe. And now, even his strength wasn't enough. What I didn't know then was that my death, my disappearance beneath the waves, would become more than just the loss of a child. It would become a symbol of the thousands of children, just like me, who had drowned in these same waters, whose lives had been claimed by the same waves. My story was not just my own. It was the story of every child who had lost their life in the pursuit of a better future. The story of every family that had been torn apart by war, by displacement, by hopelessness. The loss of my life, my innocent life, was a psychological wound that would never heal. For my father, for my mother, for all the people who knew us, My death was a painful reminder of how fragile life is, how easily it can be taken away. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard we try, no matter how much we hope, we cannot outrun the storms that come for us. And yet, my story, this child's story, would not fade into the background. It would not be forgotten. It was not just a tragedy. It was a wake-up call. It was a breaking story that would shake the world to its core, a story that would demand to be heard, to be felt. For the world needed to understand. It needed to feel the pain of what happened, to comprehend the true cost of war, of displacement, and of the choices we make. The tragedy of my death was not just the loss of one child. It was the loss of millions. It was the loss of innocence, the loss of hope, and the loss of a future. My death became a story that no one could ignore, a story that would reverberate around the world. It was a story of war, of migration, and of human suffering. It was a story that spoke not only to the pain of Syria, but to the pain of every refugee, every displaced person, and every child caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't start. As I drifted away from this world, my story lived on. It lived in the hearts of the people who saw my lifeless body on the shores of Turkey. It lived in the minds of those who heard my name, who saw my face, who understood that I was just one of many. It became a story that could no longer be ignored, a story that would change the world. My story was not just about a child who died. It was about the millions who were still alive, still fighting for their lives, still seeking safety. In the end, my story was not just mine. It was everyone's story. It was the story of survival, of loss, of courage, and of the indomitable strength of the human spirit. It was a story that demanded to be told, no matter the cost. And though my life was cut short, my legacy lived on in the stories of those who followed me, those who lived through the same horrors, those who still had the strength to hope. I never knew that my life, my short, fragile life, would become a symbol. I never understood that my story would reach beyond the borders of Syria, beyond the shores of the sea, to the far corners of the world. But on September 2nd, 2015, my lifeless body washed ashore on the beaches of Bodrum, Turkey. A photographer captured that moment, and in an instant, my story was no longer just mine. It was the world's. The photograph, a haunting image of a child's body left face down in the sand, became a reflection of the horrors we had experienced, of the suffering that millions of refugees faced every day. It wasn't just a photo. It was an awakening. It was a call to action. The world, for the first time, was forced to see the human cost of war, the true face of the refugee crisis, through the eyes of an innocent child. When the photo of my body spread across social media, it didn't just raise awareness, it sparked a global outcry. People from all over the world were moved, shaken, and enraged. The image of my small, lifeless form became a symbol of the tragic loss of life, the brutality of war, and the desperation of those fleeing for their lives. My death, in a strange way, opened the eyes of the world to the suffering of countless others like me. Governments around the world began to respond. Policies on refugee resettlement were revisited. Some countries pledged to take in more refugees, to open their borders, to give us a chance at a better life. There were protests, rallies, and calls for change. But there was something that people couldn't quite grasp. The fact that the pain my family felt, the pain of my father, my mother, my brother, could never be undone. No amount of political change could bring us back. No campaign, no gesture could reverse the loss. My uncle, Tima Kurdi, moved to Canada after the tragedy, dedicating himself to raising awareness about the plight of refugees. He worked tirelessly to bring attention to the ongoing crisis, to give a voice to the millions of displaced people who had no one to listen to them. His efforts, and the efforts of so many others, became a movement. My story, my death, had transformed into a global call for action, a demand for humanity to stand up, to act, to make sure that no more children like me would drown in the sea. It is hard to put into words the psychological impact of my death. My life, my death, became a mirror reflecting the suffering of so many others. It wasn't just a child's death, it was the death of innocence, the death of hope. The world saw me, and in seeing me, they saw the millions of others who had suffered in silence, who had lost their lives, their families, their homes, in pursuit of a dream of safety and peace. In the eyes of my father, I was more than just his son. I was the embodiment of a lost future, of a future that was stolen from us by the violence that consumed our world. My mother, who had tried so hard to protect me, who had dreamed of a better life for me, was now left with nothing but the memory of what could have been. My father's pain was immeasurable. He had lost his family, his hope, his reason for living. But my death, the death of a child, this child, was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a global tragedy. It shook the conscience of the world. It became a breaking story that transcended borders, languages, and cultures. It demanded to be heard, to be understood. It was a story that spoke of war, of suffering, and of the human cost of conflict. It was a child's story, a true story, that could no longer be ignored. My death was the turning point in the refugee crisis. For years, the world had turned a blind eye to the suffering of displaced people. The crisis had been unfolding for years, but it took my death to bring it to the forefront of global consciousness. The photo of my body was a wake-up call, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. People who had once been indifferent were now forced to confront the reality of the crisis. But there was also something deeper at play, the psychological impact on humanity itself. People were no longer able to separate themselves from the suffering of others. My death forced people to question their own values, their own responsibility. How could a world so full of abundance allow a child to drown on a beach? How could governments, organizations, and individuals turn a blind eye to the suffering of those fleeing war and persecution? The reaction to my death was overwhelming, but it also raised questions that lingered. The world mourned my loss, but it also became a moment of self-reflection. People began to ask themselves, what can we do to stop this? What can we do to make sure that no more children like Aylan will lose their lives in this way? My story, in the end, wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of awakening. It was a story of the world coming face to face with its own humanity. Even though I am no longer here, my story has lived on. My name, my face have become symbols of the refugee crisis, of the need for change. But it is not enough to remember my story. It is not enough to feel sadness for a moment and then move on. My story must be a catalyst for change, a driving force behind the global effort to end the suffering of millions of refugees. In the years that have passed since that tragic day on the beach, the world has not forgotten me. My story continues to resonate with people around the globe, continuing to raise awareness, continuing to demand action. My death became a turning point, a breaking point. But the fight for the rights of refugees continues. My family continues to fight, to speak out, to ensure that my death was not in vain. The world may have heard my story, but it is up to all of us to make sure that it doesn't become just another tragic tale lost in the sands of time. My story, the story of a child who lost everything, must be the story that drives change. It must be the story that pushes the world to act, to ensure that no more children drown in the sea, that no more families are torn apart by war. This is the true story of Aylan Kurdi, a child whose death sparked a global movement, whose story became a voice for millions of others like him. And it is a story that must continue to be told.